gigging, blading, cutting, getting color, drawing blood, the poke, getting juice, the hard way, getting busted open, or just simply bleeding on camera. When did it start? And is it still a big deal to this day? Welcome to Wrestling Through the Ages. Blood hasn't always been part of the sport of wrestling. Wait, sport? Yes, that's right. In North America, back during the golden age of wrestling, roughly 1890s, early 1900s, wrestling was a strongman sport and was 100% legitimate, with the strongest man of a certain town or even a traveling circus act offering a lump sum to any man that could defeat him via pinning both shoulders to the ground or submitting your opponent. Wrestling was booming. Gymnasiums and auditoriums were getting filled to the brim, bringing in, at times, entire towns to the show. But what happens when the legitimacy of the sport is called into question? Blading was introduced back in the 1930s by Kirby Watkins, the hard way. The hard way is exactly what it sounds like. Kirby would punch above the eyebrow line, splitting open a gash, and the blood would mix in with the wrestler's sweat, making it appear much worse than it was. However, depending what state, province, or city you so happen to live in, your first exposure to blood may not have come till the latter half of the century. For example, San Francisco saw its first bloody crimson mask when Mark Lewin accidentally kneed Mike Sharp in the forehead, splitting it open, and shocked all the fans in attendance. However, when you are on top and in the main event, you are expected to shed some blood, and even having the promoter pushing you to do so. During the 60s and 70s, Edward George Farhat, the original Sheik, his gimmick revolved around bleeding. He would bring a sharpened pencil, taped up, and would attempt to use it on his opponents, resulting in dozens of riots. Usually, his opponent would retrieve the pencil or sharpened piece of wood and cut open the Sheik to the fans' standing ovation. The madman from Sudan, Abdullah the Butcher, would bring sharpened forks and spoons and would blade himself and his opponents, drawing controversy. With the late 70s coming to a close and the 1980s around the bend, everyone was blading, and not just for the main events. Sometimes, opening matches would include blading, which would leave the next combatants upset and angered, having to outdo the previous match, which would result in more matches with crimson bloody masks. The 90s saw a stoppage to blading in North American wrestling organizations, mostly due to the contract the promotions had with its cable channel, because wrestling in the late 80s and early 90s had been viewed more than football, basketball, hockey, and baseball. Every single TV station has its own wrestling channel, with roughly 30 wrestling organizations back then. That's like if hockey was so popular, every TV channel would have its own version of the NHL. Wrestling kept that TV station in business back during this time. Several wrestlers would be fined or released due to pressure from TV executives and threatening to pull the program. But it didn't last as long as you would think. After the end of the family-friendly era, wrestling would take a turn in the mid-90s into a more teenager and adult fan base, which, as you would guess, wanted to see blood introduced again. Eventually, we saw promotions being built around nothing but blood, with companies like Japan's FMW, led by Atsushi Onita, the Japanese blood grandfather. Philadelphia's ECW was known to have practically every single match have blood in it, or the fans would want to kill Paul Heyman for giving them kiddie wrestling matches. Both WCW and WWF would follow suit. WWF would outlaw and find talent that would draw blood as of the mid-2000s. Is blood important nowadays? Does it play a prominent role? Is it needed? My opinion? No. Promotions that push talent to draw color nowadays are mostly small local promotions that want to make their matches seem more hardcore and intense. And/or it happened live on TV by mistake, they are heavily edited out. You can see many examples of edited out footage in the later years of the WWF. This movement started in wrestling infancy years as a way to put naysayers and non-believers in their place to generate more revenue by bringing in more fans that may have thought this was an act at first. It is a shame that eventually kayfabe happened. The fourth wall broke down, and everyone grew wise to the sport of wrestling. The first pioneers used blading to submerge audiences into how serious the match was and that someone might be seriously hurt or die by the end of the bout. It's time to move on. With the age of the internet, nothing is a secret anymore, and the art of blood has dried up. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next Friday for another episode of Wrestling Through the Ages.